The fog rolled in from the harbor, thick and gray, swallowing the sounds of Port Sterling. It clung to the streetlights, creating fuzzy halos on the wet asphalt, and muffled the city's late evening hum to a distant murmur. A man in a trench coat, the color of a tired city morning, walked through it all. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than the damp chill in the air. His name was Frank Colombo, and all he wanted was a six-pack of beer. He pushed open the glass door of a 24/7 convenience store, and the sudden blast of fluorescent light and warm, stale air made him blink. A small bell chimed, tinny and unwelcome. Behind the counter, a young man with headphones around his neck looked up from his phone, his expression a flat line of boredom. "Just the beer tonight, detective?" the clerk asked, his voice monotone. "You just the beer, kid," Colombo replied, his own voice a low gravel. He made his way to the back, past aisles of brightly packaged snacks and dusty household goods. The hum of the coolers was a constant, droning companion. He pulled open a glass door, the cold mist spilling out over his hand, and reached for a familiar green and white carton. As he straightened up, his gaze drifted through the large, clean window of the store, across the rain-slicked street to the grand facade of the Sterling Trust Bank. It stood there, a temple of marble and glass, solid and permanent in the shifting fog. A black utility van, clean and unmarked, pulled up to the curb directly in front of the bank. It did so without haste, its movements deliberate. Colombo paused, his hand still on the cooler door. The van's side door slid open and 4 figures emerged. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by plain, featureless masks. They moved not like thugs, but like soldiers, their steps synchronized, their posture economical. There was no shouting, no revving engine, just a silent, fluid disembarkment. They entered the bank as if they owned it. Colombo let the cooler door swing shut with a soft hiss. The clerk was still engrossed in his phone. "Get down," Colombo said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the kid's head snap up. "Get down and stay quiet." The clerk's eyes widened as he followed Colombo's gaze. He fumbled for a moment before ducking behind the counter, disappearing from view. Colombo remained standing, a solitary figure in the brightly lit fishbowl of the store, watching the silent film play out across the street. Through the bank's large plate glass windows, he could see the figures moving with chilling precision. One stood guard at the door. 2 moved toward the tellers, their actions controlled. No wasted motion. The 4th walked calmly toward the vault area, out of sight. There were no gestures of panic from inside, no one running. It was a ballet of intimidation and efficiency. He counted the seconds in his head, the steady rhythm of a metronome. 150, 160. At 172 seconds, they emerged, carrying heavy duffel bags. They filed back into the van with the same disciplined grace. The door slid shut, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the fog as silently as it had arrived. An eerie quiet settled over the street, a vacuum left by the van's departure. Then, from far away, came the first faint cry of a siren. It was a single, lonely wail that was quickly joined by others, a chorus of urgency converging on their location. Colombo turned from the window. The 6-pack of beer he'd come for sat forgotten on the floor by the coolers. He walked to the counter. The clerk was peeking over the top, his face pale. "Call 911, Colombo said, already moving toward the door. "Tell them what you saw." He crossed the street just as the first patrol car screeched to a halt, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Blue and red lights sliced through the fog, painting the bank's marble columns in frantic, strobing colors. 2 young uniformed officers jumped out, hands on their holsters, their faces tense with adrenaline. Colombo met the first one, pulling a worn leather wallet from his trench coat and flipping it open to his detective's shield. "You saw it happen?" the officer asked, his voice tight. "From the store across the street," Colombo said, his tone even, a calm stone in a river of rising panic. "4 men, masks, no shots fired. Vehicle was a black utility van, no plates I could see. They were professionals, in and out in under 3 minutes." He let the officers take the lead, their training kicking in as they secured the entrance and barked orders into their radios. He followed them inside. The scene was one of controlled chaos. A woman was sobbing quietly on a customer service chair. Several employees huddled together, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear and the faint, clean scent of the bank's disinfectant. Colombo didn't announce himself, didn't take charge. He found a cool marble pillar near the teller stations and leaned against it, melting into the background, just another rumpled man in a trench coat. He simply watched. He listened. His attention settled on a young female teller giving a preliminary statement to one of the patrol officers. She was trying to hold herself together, but her voice trembled, and her sentences came in fragmented bursts, punctuated by shuddering breaths. "They were so quiet, so quiet. He had the gun on me, but he never raised his voice. I thought I was going to die. I just kept looking at the floor. And then he looked at the wall." She gestured with a shaking hand. "That picture," and he just reached out and straightened it. It was so strange. He stopped everything and just adjusted the painting, like he was annoyed it was crooked. "Who does that? Who does that?" The officer scribbled in his notepad, his expression a mask of professional patience, likely dismissing the detail as a nonsensical product of trauma. But the words snagged in Colombo's mind, a stray thread on a perfectly woven tapestry. The chaos began to organize itself as more units arrived. Paramedics were checking on the staff. Senior officers were establishing a perimeter. Colombo pushed himself off the pillar. He ambled through the lobby, his path seemingly aimless, navigating around clusters of uniformed officers and shaken witnesses. His walk ended in front of a section of pale, unadorned wall, broken only by a single large painting. It was a seascape, a turbulent depiction of a ship on a dark, stormy sea encased in a heavy, ornate wooden frame. The teller's words echoed in his head. He looked at the painting, not at the art, but at its placement. His eyes traced the top edge of the frame, then the sides. It hung perfectly, impeccably level. Its geometric precision against the vast emptiness of the wall was absolute. He tilted his head slightly, a small, unconscious gesture. The robbers' silent efficiency, their speed, their professionalism, all of it made a terrifying kind of sense. But this? A man pausing in the middle of a multi-million-dollar heist with the adrenaline and the risk and the guns to fix a crooked picture? That made no sense at all. And the fact that the painting now hung so perfectly straight was, to Detective Colombo, the most unsettling detail in the entire room. The perfectly straight painting was more than a detail. It was a discordant note in a symphony of chaos. A professional thief focused on the vault wouldn't care about aesthetics. A nervous amateur, high on adrenaline, wouldn't have the nerve to pause and adjust a frame. So who did? Who, in the middle of a high-stakes bank robbery, felt the obsessive need for order? "Colombo, get your head out of the clouds. The captain wants everyone back at the precinct. Now!" The shout from Sergeant O'Malley shattered the thought. Colombo blinked, the gilded frame of the painting dissolving back into the larger, messier picture of the crime scene. He nodded, took one last look at the perfectly level horizon in the seascape, and turned away, the question still nagging at the edges of his mind. The precinct was a cacophony of ringing phones and the clatter of typewriters. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, damp wool, and cigarette smoke. A world away from the sterile, antiseptic fear of the bank. Detectives in rumpled suits moved with a weary urgency, their faces grim. Colombo found a spot at the back of the crowded briefing room, leaning against a wall covered in curling wanted posters. Captain Marcus Holloway stood at the front, a bull of a man whose shoulders strained the fabric of his jacket. His face looked as if it were carved from granite and impatience. He slapped a piece of chalk against a blackboard scrawled with the bare facts of the case. "All right, listen up." His voice cut through the din like a hacksaw. "Sterling Trust, in and out in under 3 minutes. No alarms tripped until after they were gone. The MO is a clean match for the Miller crew. 4-man team, masks, military precision. They've been quiet for a year, but this has their signature all over it. I want round-the-clock surveillance on their known associates. I want every informant squeezed until they squeak. Diaz, you take the forensics report. Miller, you start canvassing the area for witnesses. Colombo, you and Peterson will handle the preliminary witness interviews. Let's get it done." He was about to turn away when a quiet question cut through the smoke. "Sir, what about the painting?" Holloway stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Colombo at the back. A vein pulsed in the captain's temple. "The what?" "The painting, sir." "In the manager's office," Colombo said, his voice even. It was adjusted. Everything else was a mess, drawers pulled out, papers everywhere. But the painting on the wall, it was perfectly straight. A few of the other detectives shifted, some hiding smirks. Holloway stared at him for a long, heavy moment. "A painting? For God's sake, Colombo, this isn't an art gallery. This is a bank robbery. They stole $200,000 in negotiable bonds. Focus on the goddamn money. Now get to work." Colombo felt the heat of embarrassment creep up his neck, but his conviction didn't waver. He simply nodded, pushed himself off the wall, and headed for the interview rooms. The money was the what. The painting, he suspected, was the why. The interview room was a small, bare, windowless box, smelling faintly of disinfectant and old desperation. A single buzzing bulb overhead cast harsh shadows on the face of Elena Petrova, the teller who had been closest to the gunmen. She was a pale woman in her late 20s, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her story of terror was delivered with a flow of tears, a coherent and compelling account of masked men, harsh whispers, and the cold, metallic feel of a gun barrel pressed to her temple. It was a perfect victim statement. Too perfect. Colombo let her finish, his pen resting idly on his notepad. He hadn't written a word. "That must have been terrifying, ma'am. I'm very sorry you had to go through that." "It was," she whispered, dabbing at her red-rimmed but strangely dry eyes with a tissue. "Did you get a chance to eat breakfast this morning, ma'am? You look pale," Colombo asked, his tone gentle, almost apologetic. Elena blinked, the smooth narrative faltering. I don't think so. I can't remember." "That's a lovely pin on your blouse," he continued, gesturing with his pen. "A gift?" She looked down at the small, elegant silver bird pinned to her simple blouse. It seemed a touch too expensive for the rest of her attire. Her hand flew to it, a protective gesture. "My mother gave it to me." "What does this have to do with anything?" "Oh, nothing, I'm sure. It's just, you notice things, you know, little details, like that pin, or like, for instance, in your statement, you said the man with the shotgun had cold, gray eyes. But all the robbers were wearing dark sunglasses under their ski masks." The color drained from Elena Petrova's face. Her practiced fear was replaced by a flash of something much more genuine. Her hands tightened on the worn leather of her purse. I thought I saw them. I was scared. I just want this to be over." "Of course you do, ma'am," Colombo said, closing his notebook. "I think we have enough for now. Thank you for your time." As soon as the door closed behind Elena, another one opened. Captain Holloway filled the doorway, his face a thundercloud. He cornered Colombo in the narrow hallway, his voice a low growl that vibrated with anger. "What in the hell did you think you're doing in there, Colombo?" "Sir, I was interviewing the witness. You were playing psychiatrist. I had Peterson listening in. She's the victim. We need facts, license plates, voices, not her goddamn dietary habits. You upset her." "Sir, with all due respect, her story, it didn't feel right," Colombo tried to explain, keeping his voice calm. "It was like she was reading it from a script, too neat, too practiced." "I don't pay you for your feelings," Holloway snarled, jabbing a thick finger into Colombo's chest. "I pay you to be a cop, to follow procedure. You're off the interviews. I'm putting you on paperwork that even you can't screw up." Cross-reference the MO from every professional heist in the last 5 years with the known associates of the Miller gang. "I want it on my desk by morning." Colombo stood silent for a moment, the force of the captain's fury washing over him. He felt the familiar slow burn of frustration, the quiet anger of being dismissed. He simply said, "Yes, sir." An hour later, he sat at his cluttered desk, a small island in a sea of bureaucratic noise. Mountains of manila folders towered on either side of him, smelling of dust and forgotten crimes. The clatter of typewriters and the endless ringing of phones faded into a dull hum. Holloway wanted him buried in the past, lost in the cold facts of old cases. But Colombo's mind was still in the bank manager's office, with the perfectly straight painting, and in the interview room with the teller whose fear was real, but whose story was a lie. He pushed aside the file on the Miller gang. There was another list he needed to see, a much shorter, more exclusive one. He picked up the phone, dialing the records clerk. He would have to be discreet, but he would get it. The list of every VIP client who had a scheduled appointment at Sterling Trust yesterday. The list wasn't official. It was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, passed to him by a clerk in records who owed him a favor for overlooking a minor gambling debt. Colombo smoothed it out under his desk lamp, the cone of yellow light illuminating the typed names in the otherwise dark, silent squad room. The air was stale with the ghosts of yesterday's coffee and cheap cigars. He'd told Captain Holloway he was just tying up loose ends, but this felt more like unraveling a thread no one else had even seen. His eyes skipped past the expected names: councilmen, socialites, CEOs. Each had a simple, verifiable reason for their presence at Sterling Trust that morning, or a mundane, easily checked alibi for their absence. A dentist appointment, a flight to Chicago. Then his fingers stopped on a name that felt different: Julian Thorne. Next to it, the clerk had scribbled the note from the bank's appointment ledger. Appointment on 10:00 a.m. Cancelled via phone call at 9:48 a.m. Reason: urgent issue at construction site. Colombo leaned back, the old wooden chair groaning in protest. 12 minutes. 12 minutes before the robbers hit the vault, Mr. Thorne has an emergency that forces him to cancel. It was perfect, flawless, and that was the problem. Life was messy. Emergencies were chaotic. They didn't happen with the clean, convenient timing of a stage cue. This alibi wasn't just good. It was architectural. It was designed. A quick call to a contact at the city planning department filled in the blanks. Julian Thorne wasn't just a name. He was a signature, etched in glass and steel across the city's skyline. A celebrated architect, a visionary, a man who built monuments to wealth and power. He wasn't the type to be caught in a back alley with a sack of cash. He was the type who lived above the alleys altogether. Colombo found the number for Thorne's firm, Thorne & Associates, and dialed. A crisp female voice answered on the first ring. "Thorne and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "Yes, hello. This is Lieutenant Colombo, Police Department. I was hoping to have a brief word with Mr. Thorne." There was a pause, the kind that conveyed polite, impenetrable defense. "I'm afraid Mr. Thorne's schedule is booked for the remainder of the week. Is this regarding a personal or a professional matter?" "Oh, it's just police business, ma'am. A routine follow-up." Colombo injected a note of weary apology into his voice. "I know he's a very busy man. I can see that. It's just one tiny thing, a loose end. You know how it is. It won't take more than 5 minutes of his time. I'd be so grateful." Another calculated pause. He could almost hear her weighing the potential nuisance of him against the potential trouble of refusing a police lieutenant. "Hold, please." He held, listening to the faint classical music on the line, feeling a world away from the precinct's grit. The voice returned, a degree warmer, but still firm. "Mr. Thorne can see you at 1 o'clock. The penthouse floor, please be prompt." The Thorne building was a spear of dark glass that pierced the afternoon sky. In the lobby, the air was cool and smelled of money and polished marble. Colombo, feeling the familiar rumple of his raincoat, rode the silent, high-speed elevator, watching the city shrink below him. It felt less like an ascent and more like a decompression, leaving the noisy, complicated world behind for something cleaner, quieter, and higher up. The penthouse office was less a room than a frame for the sky. 3 of the 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the metropolis that Thorne himself had helped shape. The space was a study in minimalist perfection, a single black desk that seemed to float above the white floor, 2 severe-looking chrome and leather chairs, and nothing else. No clutter, no papers, no personal effects. It was sterile, silent, and intimidating. Julian Thorne rose from behind the desk as Colombo entered. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He moved with an easy, athletic grace that belied his age, and his smile was both charming and utterly devoid of warmth. "Lieutenant Colombo, Julian Thorne." His handshake was firm and brief. "Please, have a seat. Coffee?" "Oh, no thank you, sir. I've had my fill for the day. Wouldn't want to be up all night." Colombo settled into one of the chairs, which was as uncomfortable as it looked. He felt like a stray cat that had wandered into a surgical theater. "My secretary said this was about the unfortunate business at Sterling Trust." Thorne sat opposite him, a king surveying his domain. "A terrible affair. I trust you're making progress?" "We're getting there, sir. Little by little. That's why I'm here. Just clearing up the details. The bank mentioned you had an appointment that morning." Thorne nodded, his expression one of mild regret. "I did. 10 o'clock. A pity I had to miss it. A crisis at the foundation pour for the new arts center. A potential disaster with the concrete mixture. I was halfway to the bank when I got the call from my foreman. I had to turn the car around immediately." He delivered the lines with practiced ease. It was a flawless performance. "A real shame," Colombo said, his eyes wandering around the vast, empty room. "This view, it's something else. You can see the whole city." "Do you find it helps you think, sir, being up above it all?" A flicker of amusement crossed Thorne's face. He was being indulged. "Order from chaos, Lieutenant. That is my profession. To take the mess of human needs and impose a logical, beautiful structure upon it. Now, with all due respect, my canceled appointment seems like the least interesting aspect of a major bank robbery." "You're probably right, sir. It's just, we have to check every box." Colombo stood up, as if preparing to leave, and ambled toward the corner of the room. There, on a large platform, stood a magnificent architectural model. It was a miniature city block, the future site of the cultural center Thorne had mentioned. It was rendered in breathtaking detail. Wow! Is this it? The Arts Center? The very same, Thorne said, a hint of pride in his voice. Colombo leaned closer, squinting. He noted the clean lines, the tiny, perfect trees, the gleaming miniature structures. But his focus snagged on the little human figures populating the plazas and walkways. They weren't clustered in conversational groups. They weren't scattered randomly. Each figure was placed with geometric precision, perfectly spaced from its neighbor, forming symmetrical patterns of foot traffic. There was no life to them, no chaos, just pure, obsessive order. "It's beautiful," Colombo said, his voice soft. He turned back to the architect. "Well, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you for your cooperation, sir. You've been very helpful. I'm sorry to have bothered you." Thorne saw him to the door, the picture of polite dismissal. The detective was, as he had suspected, a harmless, rumpled civil servant chasing procedural phantoms. The elevator doors slid shut, and Colombo descended back into the noise and mess of the city. He sat in his beat-up Peugeot for a long moment, the engine off, the keys dangling from the ignition. He had nothing, no evidence, no slip-up, not a single crack in Thorne's polished facade. The man was in control, too in control. Then his mind flashed back to the model. He saw the tiny figures, not a single one out of place, all arranged in perfect, unnatural symmetry. Another image surfaced, sharp and clear. The crime scene photo of the bank president's office. The chaos, the drawers pulled out, the papers strewn everywhere. And on the wall, the single painting of a ship at sea, hanging perfectly, immaculately straight. The two images merged in his mind. The perfectly arranged people on the model, the perfectly straightened painting in the ransacked room. It wasn't logic. It wasn't evidence. It was a signature, an obsession with imposing order on chaos. And it was the first real thing he'd found. A signature. The thought was as clean and perfect as one of Thorne's blueprints, but it was also useless. You couldn't arrest a man for being neat. Colombo stared at the crime scene photos spread across his desk. The chaos of the robbery, a stark contrast to the one perfectly aligned chair. A hunch was a flimsy thing, a ghost in the machine of police work. It couldn't be filed in a report or presented to a judge. It needed a body, a foundation. It needed facts. He pushed the photos aside, the image of Julian Thorne's calm, appraising eyes floating in his mind. A man that meticulous, that controlling, must have left a trail somewhere else, long before the Sterling Trust vault was ever opened. The Port Sterling Municipal Archive smelled of decaying paper and forgotten time. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, fell in long shafts from the tall, grimy windows, illuminating rows upon rows of bound volumes and metal filing cabinets. A man with thinning gray hair and ink stains on his shirt cuffs looked up from a ledger as Colombo approached the counter. "Can I help you, detective?" the archivist asked, his voice as dry as the pages surrounding them. "Oh, I hope so. Frank Colombo." He offered a tired smile and flashed his badge. "Sorry to bother you. I know this is a long shot. Just doing a little background, tying up loose ends on a case. My captain, he's a stickler for details. You know how it is." The archivist gave a weary nod of understanding. "What are you looking for?" "Anything you have on the architect, Julian Thorne. Business dealings, major projects, newspaper mentions from the last, say, 10 years. The man led him to a microfiche reader in a dim corner. The machine whirred to life with a low hum. For the next 2 hours, Colombo scrolled through years of newsprint, the black and white text flickering past his eyes. There was endless praise for Thorne's genius. Articles celebrating the clean lines of the new city courthouse, the innovative use of glass in the waterfront redevelopment. It was a public record of perfection. Then, buried deep in the business section from 6 years ago, he found it. A small article detailing a lawsuit. A former partner, a man named Alistair Finch, had sued Thorne for intellectual theft. The case was dismissed. A follow-up piece a month later was even smaller. A brief note on Finch filing for bankruptcy. The final mention was an interview with Thorne, who expressed only calm, professional regret that his former colleague had lost his way. There were no more articles about Alistair Finch. He had simply vanished, his career and reputation erased with the quiet precision of a draftsman's pencil. Colombo leaned back, the hum of the machine filling the silence. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was a pattern. It was the signature. The Sterling Trust Bank was unnervingly silent after closing. The scent of ammonia and floor polish had replaced the smell of fear and gunpowder. Colombo's footsteps echoed on the marble as a young, bored security guard let him in. "Captain said the scene was released, Detective. Everything's been cleaned." I know. Colombo waved a dismissive hand, his expression apologetic. "Just one last look. There was something bothering me, a little detail. It's probably nothing. I won't be long." The guard shrugged and returned to his chair by the entrance, his attention already on a crossword puzzle. Colombo walked past the teller windows, ignoring the vault. He wasn't interested in what was taken. He was interested in what might have been brought in. He stopped near the entrance to the president's office, the area where Thorne had stood so calmly surveying the scene. He looked at the floor, a seamless expanse of polished dark wood parquet. He crouched, his rumpled trench coat bunching around him. Then, to the guard's bemused stare, he got down on his hands and knees. Slowly, methodically, he ran his fingertips along the seams between the floorboards. He was a man searching for a dropped coin, patient and utterly focused. And then he saw it. Wedged deep in a hairline crack was a speck of something that didn't belong. It wasn't dust or grime. It was a tiny, hard fleck of reddish-brown earth, the color of terracotta. In this hermetically sealed world of polished wood and cool marble, it was as out of place as a footprint on the moon. He pulled a small penknife from his pocket, carefully pried the minuscule clod of dirt free, and tipped it into a small glassine envelope. He sealed it, the quiet crinkle of the plastic unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. It was the first thing, the first real thing. Captain Holloway was waiting for him by his desk. The squad room was emptying out for the night. The air stale with the day's exhaust of coffee and cigarettes. Holloway's face was a thundercloud. His jaw set so tight, a muscle pulsed beneath the skin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "My office, Frank, now." Colombo followed him in, and Holloway shut the door, the click of the latch punctuating the tension. "What the hell were you doing back at the bank?" Holloway began, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And don't give me that just one more thing routine. I got a call, Frank, from the head of Sterling Trust's corporate security, about one of my detectives crawling around on the floor like a goddamn janitor. I'm sorry, Captain, I had a thought, a loose end. It's probably nothing, but..." "Nothing? You're harassing one of the most respected men in this city based on nothing. Julian Thorne is a civic leader. He's on the mayor's planning commission. People like that don't rob banks. They build them." Holloway leaned across his desk, his eyes boring into Colombo. "The Sterling Trust case is about the 3 men on the tape and the stolen bearer bonds. That's it. We have witnesses. We have forensics working the getaway car. That is the investigation. I don't know what kind of fantasy you're chasing, but it ends tonight. You are to drop this obsession with Julian Thorne. Leave him alone. Is that understood, Detective?" Colombo stood there, the captain's words echoing in the sudden silence of the office. He could feel the slight weight of the evidence envelope in his coat pocket, a secret warmth against his side.
"Yes, sir,"
he said, his voice quiet, his eyes fixed on a point just past Holloway's shoulder. "Understood." The heavy oak door of Captain Holloway's office clicked shut behind him, the sound as final as a gavel's strike. "Is that understood, Detective?" The captain's words echoed not in the hallway, but inside Colombo's own skull. He had said, "Yes, sir," but the real answer was a quiet, stubborn burn in his chest. In his raincoat pocket, his fingers found the corner of a small, stiff manila envelope. It was a tiny weight, almost nothing, yet it felt heavier than the badge clipped to his belt. It was the truth, or a piece of it, and he had just been ordered to let it go. He walked through the bullpen, the clatter of typewriters and the tinny jangle of ringing telephones sounding like they came from a great distance. His own desk was an archipelago of case files and coffee-stained notes, adrift in a sea of official paperwork. He sank into his creaking chair, the worn leather groaning in protest. For a long moment, he just sat there, the sounds of the precinct slowly returning to their normal pitch. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pulled the envelope from his pocket. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He could already see the smear of reddish-brown clay through the small evidence window. This didn't belong in a bank vault. It belonged somewhere else. And so did the man who had left it there. He pulled a small key from his chain, unlocked the bottom drawer of his metal desk, and slid the envelope deep into the back, behind a stack of cold case files from his rookie years. The click of the lock was quiet, but for Colombo, it was as loud as a gunshot. He was staring at a loose thread on his cuff when the phone on his desk gave a shrill, insistent ring that made him jump. He picked up the receiver, tucking it between his shoulder and ear. "Detective Colombo." A voice answered, smooth and unhurried, like aged whiskey. It was a voice that expected to be listened to. "Detective, this is Julian Thorne. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Colombo straightened in his chair, his hand hovering over a notepad. "No, not at all, Mr. Thorne. What can I do for you?" "It's likely nothing, a minor detail I've been turning over in my mind since our conversation. It occurs to me that in the shock of the event, one's memory can play tricks. I believe I neglected to mention something about the man who approached the cashier." Colombo's pen was poised. He could feel the fine, invisible wires of a trap being laid. "Oh, any detail could be helpful, sir." "Precisely. Though I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. I was about to have a late dinner downtown. Perhaps you'd allow me to trouble you for a few minutes of your time? Say, the Chancellor's Club in half an hour?" "It would be most convenient." The name of the restaurant hung in the air, a statement of a world Colombo rarely entered. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. "The Chancellor's Club," Colombo repeated, scribbling it down with a pen that was running out of ink. He made a show of shaking it. "Ah, just a second, my pen. Could you give me that address one more time, sir? I'm a little disorganized tonight." Thorne repeated the address with a hint of indulgent patience. When Colombo hung up the phone, the silence in the precinct felt different. It was no longer just the end of a long day. It was the quiet before a storm. The Chancellor's Club was a sanctuary of hushed tones, dark wood, and the subtle glint of polished silver. Men in tailored suits spoke in low murmurs over plates of food Colombo couldn't name. He stood in the entrance for a moment, his rumpled raincoat feeling less like clothing and more like a costume from a different, cheaper play. Thorne was already seated at a secluded corner table, a single glass of deep red wine before him. He rose as Colombo approached, a picture of effortless grace. "Detective, thank you for coming. Please." Colombo shrugged off his coat, draping it over the back of the plush leather chair, where it looked bulky and foreign. He sat, fidgeting with the heavy linen napkin. "It's no trouble, Mr. Thorne. You said you remembered something." Thorne smiled, a slow, confident expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. He signaled a waiter. "All in due time. First, let's get you a drink. What will you have?" "Oh, just water for me, please. I'm on duty." "Sort of." Thorne's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. He ordered the water and then leaned back, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers beneath his chin. "I am an architect, Detective. My entire life is about structure, about design. In any great design, whether it's a skyscraper or a simpler enterprise, the strength lies in the foundation. If the foundation is flawless, the structure is impregnable. The police, if you'll forgive me, seem to be tapping at the penthouse windows, hoping to get in." Colombo nodded slowly, his brow furrowed as if trying to grasp a complex theorem. "That's fascinating, sir, really. You see the whole building? I just see the bricks, and right now, I'm stuck on one brick." Thorne raised an eyebrow, amused. "And which brick is that?" "It's probably nothing. It's just my wife. She always tells me I get stuck on the silliest thing. It's that picture on the wall. The one that was crooked. The one the robber supposedly straightened before he left. It just seems so odd. A man who's just stolen $500,000, and he's worried about a crooked painting. For the first time, a flicker of something other than serene confidence crossed Thorne's face. It was a microscopic tightening around his eyes, an irritation so fleeting it was almost imaginary. An observation of a nervous tic, perhaps. "A compulsion?" Thorne said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "The criminal mind is rarely a tidy one." "I suppose so," Colombo said, looking down at his water glass. "It's just, you seem like a man who appreciates order. A man like you. If you had a picture in your home, I bet it would always be perfectly straight. It would bother you if it wasn't." Thorne's gaze hardened. The game had shifted. "I appreciate precision, Detective, in all things. Now, the detail I wanted to mention was the man's shoes. I recall now they were scuffed, poorly made. An insignificant detail, I'm sure, but you said anything might help." Colombo knew it was a piece of misdirection, a worthless breadcrumb thrown to lead him away. He let it hang in the air. "Scuffed shoes. Thank you, sir. That's very helpful," he said, his voice earnest. "You know, all this talk of foundations, it makes me think of that little bit of clay we found, reddish stuff from the floor. Funny how something so small can get carried so far from where it belongs." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Thorne picked up his wine glass, studying the dark liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. He took a slow, deliberate sip before placing it back on the table with a soft click. "The city is full of construction sites, Detective, full of dirt and clay. A man with scuffed shoes could have walked through any number of them. It seems you are determined to build your own foundation from a single speck of dust." He smiled again, but this time it was all sharp edges. The mask was back in place, flawless and impenetrable. Later, standing on the cold pavement outside the restaurant, Colombo turned his collar up against the wind. The warm, golden light of the Chancellor's Club seemed a world away. He hadn't gotten a confession. He hadn't gotten a single piece of actionable evidence. But as he replayed the conversation, he knew he had won something far more valuable. He had seen the flicker. He had touched the architect's perfect facade and felt the tremor of annoyance beneath. Thorne wasn't just a suspect. He was an adversary, an opponent in a game Thorne himself had designed, and he was enjoying every move. A direct assault on that intellectual fortress would be suicide. Thorne had accounted for every contingency, every structural weakness. Almost. Colombo's thoughts drifted away from the cold logic of architecture and settled on a human face, pale and wide-eyed with terror. The machine was perfect, but Thorne had been forced to use one imperfect component. A component that could be frightened. A component that could talk. Elena Petrova. The fortress that was Arthur Thorne was unbreachable. Colombo had spent the better part of a day staring at the blueprints of the man's life. His finances, his connections, his public persona, and found not so much as a hairline crack. Every wall was reinforced, every angle covered. Trying to break him down with direct force was like trying to punch through granite. But every fortress has a key, and sometimes the key isn't made of steel. Sometimes it's made of flesh and blood. Elena Petrova. The name echoed in his mind, a quiet counterpoint to Thorne's booming presence. She was the imperfect component, the piece that didn't quite fit the polished machine of the Sterling Trust. He put Thorne's file aside. The real work began in the dim, dusty corners of public records and hushed phone calls to contacts who owed him favors. The picture of Elena Petrova that emerged was not one of a hardened criminal accomplice. It was a portrait painted in shades of quiet desperation. A modest apartment in a neighborhood that was slowly decaying. A recent flurry of credit inquiries, all denied. Most telling was a lien against her mother's small house, filed by a private oncology clinic. The numbers told a story of a daughter drowning, trying to keep her mother's head above water, while her own lungs filled with debt. She wasn't a key to the fortress. She was the crumbling section of the wall everyone had overlooked. The late afternoon air was thick with a damp chill that promised more rain. A fine mist hung over the city, blurring the streetlights into hazy halos. Colombo waited in his car across from the bank's employee entrance, the engine off, the only sound the rhythmic squeak of his windshield wipers. He watched the river of anonymous employees flow out onto the sidewalk, faces tired, shoulders slumped. Then he saw her. Elena Petrova looked smaller than she had in the interview room, swallowed by a drab, worn coat. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she walked with the hurried, head-down gait of someone who wants to be invisible. He gave her a 30-second head start before getting out of his car, pulling the collar of his raincoat up around his neck. He caught up to her at the corner, his footsteps soft on the damp pavement. He came up alongside her, not in front, careful not to startle her. "Pardon me, Miss Petrova," he said, his voice gentle. She flinched, her whole body tensing as she recognized him. Her eyes, wide and frightened, darted around the street as if looking for an escape route. I have nothing more to say," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I know, and I'm sorry to bother you. It's an imposition, really. It's just..." He paused, letting out a small, weary sigh. "Something about your testimony. It felt like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. My wife says I notice things like that." He gestured with a thumb toward a small, brightly lit coffee shop on the next block. "Look, it's cold out here. Let me buy you a cup of coffee. 5 minutes, just to get out of this damp. It would be a favor to me, honestly. My feet are soaked." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the warm glow of the cafe window, a tiny island of light in the growing dusk. She looked from the cafe back to his face, a face that held no threat, only a kind of rumpled exhaustion that mirrored her own. After a long moment, she gave a single tight nod. The coffee shop was an oasis of anonymous warmth. The air smelled of burnt sugar and roasting beans, and the low murmur of conversation provided a comforting blanket of sound. They found a small booth in the corner, the vinyl cracked but clean. Condensation fogged the lower half of the window, distorting the view of the rainy street into a watercolor blur. Colombo helped her out of her damp coat, noticing the frayed threads at the cuff. She sat stiffly, her hands clutching her purse in her lap like a shield. A waitress came, and Colombo ordered 2 black coffees. When they arrived, Elena wrapped both her hands around the thick ceramic mug, as if absorbing its heat into her bones. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. Colombo just let the silence sit between them. Fumbling in his coat pocket for a cigar, he had no intention of lighting. "My wife's cousin," he said suddenly, looking at the unlit cigar in his hand. "Good kid, mechanic, works hard. But his father got sick a few years back. The bills? They just kept coming. You pay one, two more show up." He started working doubles, taking cash jobs on the side, anything he could. You could just see the pressure building. Sometimes you feel like there's no way out, you know? Like you're in a room and the walls are just slowly closing in. Elena's knuckles were white around her mug. She didn't look at him, but stared down into the black liquid. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a quick, angry gesture. "My mother, she worked her whole life," Elena said, her voice thick. "In a textile factory. Never missed a day. She saved. She was careful. She did everything right. And for what? So some disease can eat away at her, and the doctors can eat away at everything she ever earned? It's not fair." "No, ma'am," Colombo said softly. "It's not fair at all." She finally looked at him, her eyes brimming with a mixture of grief and defiance. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a desperate need to be heard. "I send money home every week, but it's never enough. The treatments, the medication, it's a hole with no bottom. I just wanted to help her. I wanted her to be comfortable." He saw the opening, a fragile path into the heart of the matter. He had to tread carefully. He leaned forward just a fraction, his voice dropping to a near whisper. That kind of pressure. It can make a person do things they wouldn't normally do. It must be hard, having to go to work every day, seeing the same faces, and having to pretend everything is normal afterward. The word hung in the air between them. Pretend. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The fragile connection shattered. The color drained from Elena's face, leaving it a waxy, pale mask. Her eyes widened, yet darting past him, scanning the faces of the other patrons in the cafe as if she expected to see a familiar, menacing figure in the crowd. The mug clattered against the saucer as she put it down, her hand trembling violently. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice ragged with panic. "Miss Petrova, it's all right." "No!" Her whisper became a choked sob. She fumbled in her purse, throwing a few crumpled bills onto the table. "Please, just leave me alone. You don't understand. He'll know we talked. He knows everything. If he thinks I talked..." She didn't finish the sentence. She scrambled out of the booth, grabbing her coat and stumbling toward the door. She pushed it open and fled into the dark, rainy street, vanishing into the night as if she were a ghost. Colombo sat motionless in the sudden ringing silence of the booth. Her half-empty coffee cup sat cooling on the table, a testament to the trust he had built and then broken. He looked out the steamy window, but she was gone. The warmth of the cafe felt cloying now, the low chatter of other customers like a language from a different world. He knew he was right. He had found the key, but in turning it, he hadn't just unlocked a secret, he had triggered an alarm, and its silent, deadly scream was now echoing in a place he could not see. He had just painted a target on the back of a terrified, desperate woman, and the game had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous. The warm air from the cafe vanished as the door clicked shut behind him, replaced by the damp chill of the November night. Colombo stood on the sidewalk, his hands deep in the pockets of his raincoat, and watched Elena's retreating figure until she was just another shadow swallowed by the city's indifferent glow. He had pushed her, and in doing so, he had pushed a button. A silent alarm had been tripped, not in a bank vault, but somewhere deep within the polished, impenetrable world of Julian Thorne. The fear in her eyes wasn't just for herself. It was a warning he had failed to heed until this very moment. He felt a profound sinking sense of responsibility. He had used her, coaxed the truth from her with soft words and the promise of justice, and in doing so, he had painted a target on her back. He got into his Peugeot, the engine groaning to life with a familiar reluctance. His first instinct was a primal protective urge to follow her, to park across the street from her apartment building and watch over her through the night. He even turned the car in the direction of her neighborhood, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. But he stopped after 2 blocks, pulling over to the curb beneath a flickering street lamp. What good would it do? His presence would be an announcement, a clumsy confirmation of her betrayal. Thorne wasn't the kind of man who needed to see a police car to know where the danger was coming from. He would know, and Colombo's car parked on her street would be a death sentence, not a shield. He was trapped, utterly, frustratingly trapped. He turned the key, silencing the engine, and sat in the sudden quiet. The police radio on the passenger seat crackled to life, a disembodied voice reporting a routine domestic dispute on the other side of town. The mundane rhythm of the city's troubles felt a world away from the singular, sophisticated menace he was facing. He was a detective, armed with a badge and the law, yet he felt as helpless as a child in the dark. The radio crackled again, this time with a different tone. All units, be advised. Detective Colombo, please respond. Report to Captain Holloway at the precinct. Immediately! The voice was clipped, official, and held a note of urgency that sent a fresh wave of cold through him, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The precinct was stuffy, overheated, and smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The usual late-night hum of activity felt different tonight, charged with a tension that seemed to follow him from the moment he walked through the doors. The walk to Captain Holloway's office felt longer than usual, a slow march across a sea of linoleum under the stark, unforgiving fluorescent lights. Holloway's secretary, a woman who usually offered a tired smile, simply nodded at him, her eyes darting away as if she couldn't bear to look at him. She didn't need to say a word. He knew. Captain Holloway was standing behind his massive oak desk, not sitting. His jacket was off, his tie was loosened, but he looked as rigid as a statue. A thick plume of cigar smoke hung in the air around his head like a storm cloud. He didn't invite Colombo to sit. He just stared, his eyes narrowed, the fury in them a palpable force in the room. The commissioner called me. At home. On my private line. Holloway's voice was dangerously low, a growl that promised an eruption. He took a long, slow draw from his cigar, the tip glowing like a hot coal. He was relaying a message from a personal friend of his, a man who contributes a great deal to this city, to the mayor's re-election fund, to the Policemen's Benevolent Association. Do you have any idea who Julian Thorne is, Detective? Colombo kept his hands loosely at his sides, trying to project a calm he did not feel. Captain, if you'd just let me explain about the girl, about Elena. She's terrified. She confirmed that Sterling— I don't want to hear her name, Holloway snapped, slamming his palm down on the desk. The photos of his smiling family rattled in their frames. I want to hear you explain why you were harassing Mr. Thorne's personal assistant. Harassing. That was the word he used. A formal complaint has been filed. It's not harassment, sir. It's a detail. Something's not right with the official story. The timeline, the motive, it all feels manufactured. You've been warned, Frank. I warned you. I told you to stick to the facts, to the evidence we had. But you couldn't leave it alone. You went behind my back. You pushed. And now you've brought a world of trouble down on this house. But he's involved. I know he is. Sterling's death was too convenient. Thorne benefits from it in every conceivable way. Holloway laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of any humor. You know, you don't know anything. You have a hunch, a feeling, and you've wagered this department's reputation on it. Well, the house doesn't gamble, Colombo. The house always wins because it doesn't play stupid games. You're off the case. Colombo felt the floor drop out from under him, but he held the captain's gaze. Sir, don't, Sir Miram. You're not just off the case. In fact, you're off everything. As of this moment, you are suspended from active duty, pending a full departmental review. Hand over your badge and your weapon. The words hung in the smoky air, absolute and irrevocable. For a moment, Colombo thought of arguing, of pleading, of trying one last time to make him understand. But he saw the look on Holloway's face. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was the weary resignation of a man caught between a rock and a very high place. A man who had made a decision because he had no other choice. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a verdict. He walked out of the captain's office into the main bullpen. The clatter of typewriters, the ringing phones, the low murmur of conversation. It all seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. As he passed between the rows of desks, the sounds died down one by one, a wave of silence rippling out from him. He could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and perhaps a little bit of fear. He didn't look at any of them. He kept his gaze fixed on the frosted glass of the property clerk's window at the far end of the room. The clerk was a paunchy, balding man who'd been doing the same job for 20 years and had the permanent expression of boredom to prove it. Colombo unclipped the leather holder from his belt and placed his shield, number 714, on the worn wooden counter. The metal made a soft, final sound. Then he unholstered his service revolver, the Colt Detective Special, that had been a familiar weight on his hip for years. He laid it beside the badge. The weight of it in his hand, the cool, checkered grip, was an extension of himself he was now severing. The clerk pushed a form and a pen across the counter without a word. Colombo signed his name on the line, his hand steady. The clerk took the form, slid the badge and the firearm into separate manila envelopes, and turned away to file them. It was over. The whole transaction took less than a minute. Colombo turned and walked back through the now silent bullpen. He didn't feel angry. He didn't even feel defeated. He felt a strange, hollow clarity. He pushed through the heavy doors of the precinct and stepped back out into the cold night air. The city lights seemed sharper, the sounds of traffic more distinct. He was no longer a part of the machine. He was outside, looking in. They had taken his badge, his gun, his authority. They had taken his job, but they couldn't take the case. It was no longer a file on his desk. It was his. It was his responsibility, and he had nothing left to lose. The precinct doors hissed shut behind him, cutting off the warm, stale air of bureaucracy. The night air that hit Frank Colombo was sharp and cold. A sudden shock that did little to clear the buzzing in his head. He stood on the damp sidewalk, a man adrift. His badge felt like a phantom limb, its familiar weight absent from his pocket. They had taken his authority, his access, his very identity as a detective. He felt his pocket for the one thing they hadn't taken, the small plastic bag with its pinch of reddish clay. It was flimsy, insignificant, but it was his. It was everything. He walked without direction, the city lights blurring through the misting rain. The familiar storefronts seemed alien, as if he were seeing them for the first time. He found himself in front of a diner, its neon sign casting a lonely pink glow on the wet asphalt. Inside, the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation offered a temporary haven. He slid into a cracked vinyl booth, ordered a black coffee he didn't want, and stared into the dark liquid when it arrived. The suspension wasn't a defeat. It was a cage door swinging open. Holloway thought he had sidelined him, but he had only cut him loose. Free from procedure, from warrants, from explaining his hunches to skeptical superiors, he was alone. But he was also untethered. He pulled the small bag from his pocket and placed it on the table next to his saucer. Just a bit of dirt. But it was the right dirt, and he knew just the alchemist to tell him why. The address wasn't in any official directory. It was a memory from a different kind of case years ago, a favor returned for a favor given. He found the narrow townhouse squeezed between a laundromat and a boarded-up butcher shop. A single light burned behind a grimy basement window. He descended the rusted iron steps and knocked on the heavy wooden door. A specific rhythm he hoped the man inside would remember. After a long moment, a series of bolts scraped back, and the door opened a crack. A pair of wary, intelligent eyes peered out from the gloom. "Frankie, you look like hell. Don't tell me Holloway finally threw you out." Artie Grossman opened the door wider, revealing a cavern of organized chaos. The air smelled of ozone, acidic reagents, and decaying paper. Beakers and centrifuges from a bygone era shared shelf space with dusty binders and high-powered microscopes. A single lamp on a central workbench cast a brilliant circle of light, leaving the rest of the basement in deep shadow. Artie, a man in his 60s with a mane of white hair that defied gravity, shuffled back to his work, his stained lab coat flapping around his thin frame. "Something like that, Artie. I need a favor. Off the books. Way off." "The answer is no," Artie said without looking up from a slide he was preparing. "I'm retired. I spend my days cataloging fungal spores, not covering for cops who can't color inside the lines. My relationship with the department ended for a reason." Colombo walked over to the island of light and gently placed the small evidence bag on a clear space on the workbench. Artie glanced at it, his expression a mask of practiced indifference. "It's just a bit of dirt," Colombo said quietly, "but I think it's the right dirt. I thought it might be interesting. A unique mineral composition, maybe? Something that would challenge a man who's bored of cataloging spores." Artie let out a long, weary sigh. He pushed his spectacles up his nose and finally picked up the bag, holding it under the bright lamp. He squinted, his fingers gently working the plastic to spread the clay particles. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of an old ventilation fan. The intellectual curiosity Colombo had counted on began to flicker in the old man's eyes. Terracotta mix, by the looks of it. Modern. Probably architectural. He set the bag down and glared at Colombo. "You're a menace, Frankie. You know that? You waltz in here appealing to my vanity. I was appealing to your genius, Artie." "Same thing?" he grumbled, already reaching for a clean petri dish. "Fine. Leave it. Call the payphone on the corner of Elm and 7th tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Don't call me here again. Now get out. You're contaminating my sterile environment." Colombo nodded, Artie, a small smile touching his lips for the first time all night. He didn't say thank you. He knew Artie would have considered it an insult. The next 24 hours were a slow-motion torment of waiting. He spent the night in his car, the day in a public library, trying to quiet the engine of his mind. As 9 o'clock approached, a light drizzle began to fall, slicking the streets with a greasy sheen. He stood inside the cramped, grimy phone booth on Elm and 7th, the receiver cold against his ear, listening to the hollow sound of the dial tone. The rain streaked down the glass, distorting the city lights into a watercolor blur. At precisely 9, the phone rang, its shrill cry making him jump. He snatched the receiver. "Yeah!" Artie's voice was clipped, devoid of pleasantries. "It's a custom mix. High-grade terracotta with a specific polymer binder and an unusual quartz aggregate. Very expensive. Very specific. I ran it through a geological database I still have access to. There's only one supplier for that exact mix in the state, and they've only made one delivery in the last 6 months. Colombo held his breath, his reflection a tense silhouette in the rain-streaked glass. Where, Artie? The new Port Sterling Cultural Center. Big, ugly glass thing they're building down by the wharf. Whatever your dirt came from, Frankie, it came from there. The line clicked dead. Colombo slowly hung up the phone. The Port Sterling Cultural Center, a monument to civic pride and artistic expression, funded by philanthropists, championed by the mayor, and designed down to the last steel beam and pane of glass by the architectural firm of Julian Thorne. The first thread, a tangible physical line drawn from the mud on a killer's shoe straight to the heart of Thorne's empire. The construction site was a skeleton of steel and concrete rising into the night sky. Under the pale glow of a partial moon, it looked like the ruins of a forgotten civilization. Colombo slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, his worn leather soles making almost no sound on the gravel. He moved through the cavernous ground floor, a maze of pillars and shadows. In the distance, a lone security guard made his slow, predictable rounds, the beam of his flashlight cutting a lazy arc through the darkness. Colombo flattened himself behind a stack of drywall, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He waited until the guard passed before continuing his search, his eyes scanning the churned-up earth. He found it near the foundation of what would be the main auditorium, a large pit of the same reddish clay, damp and freshly disturbed. And there, pressed perfectly into the soft mud at the edge of the pit, were the prints. Deep, clear impressions from a work boot with a distinctive tread pattern, the very pattern a witness had fleetingly described seeing outside the bank. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of one of the prints. He was here. His gaze swept the area, looking for anything else, anything out of place. His eyes caught a flicker of white and red half buried in the mud a few feet away. He carefully worked it free. It was a pack of cigarettes, crushed and damp, but the brand was still legible. Chancellor Menthols, not a common brand, a niche choice for a smoker with particular tastes. He carefully wrapped it in his handkerchief and pocketed it. An hour later, huddled in the warmth of his car, he made one last call. A clerk in the city records office, a man who owed him for a long-forgotten kindness involving a wayward son and a lenient judge. The conversation was brief, the request simple, a list of all contractors and their employees who had been recently laid off from the Cultural Center project. 2 hours after that, a manila envelope was slid under his windshield wiper. He drove to a quiet street and turned on the dome light. He scanned the list of names, dozens of them. Electricians, welders, laborers. Then he saw it, a name on the termination list from 2 weeks ago, let go for unreliable conduct. Marcus Thorne. No relation, the file noted. A former Hollywood stuntman with a minor record for assault. And in the notes section of his union file, a detail added by a diligent foreman. Frequently takes unsanctioned smoke breaks. Brand, Chancellor Menthols. The circle was closing. He had a name. Now he just needed to make him talk. The file for Marcus Thorne lay on the passenger seat of the Peugeot, its manila-colored surface catching the intermittent glow of passing streetlights. Colombo drove with one hand on the wheel, the other tapping a nervous rhythm against his thigh. Chancellor Menthols. A construction worker's brand? Unlikely. A stuntman's brand? Maybe. A brand smoked by someone trying to be someone they're not? Now that felt closer to the truth. The address led him to a part of town where the buildings seemed to sag under the weight of their own history. A neighborhood of brick and rusted fire escapes. He found the gym tucked between a laundromat and a boarded-up butcher shop, the sound of rhythmic thuds echoing from within. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, old leather, and something metallic, like blood or ambition. Men with taped hands and flat noses moved with brutal grace around the room. In the center, a man matching Thorne's description was attacking a heavy bag, each impact a small explosion of sound. Marcus Thorne was a wall of muscle, his movements economical and powerful. Colombo approached cautiously, his rumpled raincoat a stark contrast to the singlets and shorts around him. He waited until Thorne paused, breathing heavily, to wipe his brow. "Mr. Thorne? Marcus Thorne?" The stuntman turned, his eyes narrowed. He looked Colombo up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "Depends who's asking." Lieutenant Colombo, Police Department. "I had a couple of questions about your time at the Sterling Trust construction site." Thorne laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You're a detective? You look more like a guy who lost his laundry ticket." "I get that a lot, sir. It's about your dismissal. And also, you know, it's a funny thing, but I've been trying to find a particular brand of cigarettes. Chancellor menthols. They're hard to find." Marcus picked up a towel and draped it around his neck, his expression unreadable, but for the amusement in his eyes. "Never heard of him. And my dismissal was a union thing. Boring paperwork. You're wasting your time, Lieutenant." "Well, see, the thing is, someone dropped a pack of them at the bank, right where Mr. Sterling was found. An empty pack. And your foreman said he saw you with them." Marcus took a step closer, his physical presence overwhelming. He was taller than Colombo, wider, and seemed carved from something denser than flesh and bone. "A foreman who got me fired?" He'd say anything. "You got nothing, pal. No proof, no witnesses, no case. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." He turned his back on Colombo and unleashed another flurry of punches into the heavy bag, each thud a final dismissive word. Colombo stood there for a moment, the noise of the gym pressing in on him. He had hit a wall, a solid, unmovable, laughing wall. The coffee was black and bitter, sitting untouched in a thick ceramic mug. Colombo stared out the diner window, watching his own tired reflection swim over the slick, rain-darkened streets. It was past midnight. The failure with Marcus Thorne chewed at him, a dull ache of frustration. Breaking the muscle was a dead end. Thorne was either too loyal, too well-paid, or simply too confident in the lack of evidence. Colombo's mind drifted from the stuntman's sneer to another face, Julian Thorne's. He saw the man's perfectly tailored suit, the condescending tilt of his head, the way he'd straightened the painting in the bank vault. Perfection. Control. He remembered the immaculate office, not a single pen out of place, the files aligned with geometric precision. That was it. He wasn't dealing with a common thief motivated by simple greed. He was dealing with an artist, a genius in his own mind. And what is the one thing a genius cannot tolerate? A flaw in his masterpiece. You couldn't break down the wall Marcus Thorne had built, no. But you could convince the architect that he'd left a crack in the foundation. And a man like Julian Thorne would have to come back to fix it. He wouldn't be able to stop himself. The idea began to form, a fragile spark in the lonely quiet of the diner, then growing into a steady, brilliant flame. The newsroom of the Port Sterling Chronicle was an assault on the senses. A cacophony of ringing phones, clattering typewriters, and shouted conversations. A haze of cigarette smoke hung in the air like a permanent weather system. Colombo found Jack Finnegan hunched over a desk piled high with galleys and overflowing ashtrays. Finnegan was a man from another era, with ink stains on his fingers and a permanent look of weary disappointment etched onto his face.
"Jack, I need a favor,"
Colombo said, pulling up a rickety wooden chair. Finnegan didn't look up from his copy. "Last time you asked for a favor, I spent 3 hours listening to a guy who thought his prize-winning pumpkin was spying on him. What is it this time, Frank?" A conspiracy of garden gnomes? I need you to print something for me. A small piece. City News section. Page 5, maybe 6. Now Finnegan looked up, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. Print what? A story. That the police have a new lead in the Sterling Trust case. Something about a unique manufacturing flaw in an item left at the scene. Vague. No specifics. Finnegan leaned back, the chair groaning in protest. He took a long drag from his cigarette. Frank, you want me to print fiction. I report news, not fairy tales for cops who are in over their heads. My name goes on this stuff. It's my reputation. It's not fiction, Jack. It's a question. Colombo leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. We're asking a question, and only one man in this city will feel compelled to answer it. If he's innocent, this article is just noise, forgotten by noon. But if he's guilty, if he's the man I think he is, a man like that can't stand the thought of an imperfect masterpiece. He'll have to go back and check. He won't be able to stop himself. Finnegan stared at him for a long time, the cynical mask on his face wavering. He saw the exhaustion in Colombo's eyes, but also the sharp, unwavering intelligence. He crushed out his cigarette. One time, Frank, and if this blows up, I'm telling everyone you threatened my prize-winning pumpkin. It's a deal, Jack. The city was still cloaked in the cool gray light of pre-dawn. Colombo stood across the street from a newsstand, his hands deep in his raincoat pockets. His collar turned up against the morning chill. A delivery truck rumbled to a stop, and the driver tossed 2 thick, string-tied bundles of the Chronicle onto the pavement with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the quiet street. Colombo waited until the truck had driven off, and the newsstand owner had cut the strings and stacked the papers. He crossed the street, the smell of fresh ink filling the air. He paid for a copy, his fingers fumbling slightly with the coins. He didn't open it right away. He walked to the corner, under the weak glow of a street lamp, and unfolded it. He flipped past the headlines, his heart beating a little faster now. Page 2, page 3, 4, and there it was, on page 5, tucked beside an article about a city council zoning dispute. 2 short paragraphs. New lead in Sterling homicide, the headline read. It mentioned an item of interest and a potential manufacturing anomaly being investigated by forensics. It was perfect, vague, insignificant, and utterly irresistible to the right pair of eyes. He folded the paper, tucked it neatly under his arm, and looked up. In the distance, the first rays of sun were beginning to touch the highest floors of the city's skyscrapers. He fixed his gaze on one of them, the dark, silent tower where Julian Thorne had his office. The bait was set. The morning sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian Thorne's penthouse, glinting off the chrome and glass of his meticulously ordered world. He took a slow sip of his espresso, the bitter heat of familiar and grounding ritual. His gaze swept over the city sprawling below, a kingdom of concrete and ambition he had so effortlessly conquered. His eye caught the morning paper, folded neatly on the onyx coffee table. He picked it up, his movements unhurried, a faint smile playing on his lips as he remembered the rumpled detective who had been holding its twin just the day before. He thumbed through the pages, past the blaring headlines of politics and finance, until a small column on page 7 caught his attention. Police investigate manufacturing anomaly in Sterling Heist. Thorne read the short article, his smile widening into a smirk. An item of interest, a unique clue tied to a manufacturing anomaly. Pathetic. It was the desperate flailing of incompetent minds, a ghost story concocted to create the illusion of progress. He folded the paper and set it down, dismissing it. The fools. They had nothing. He went about his morning, dressing in a bespoke suit, the fabric a whisper against his skin. But the words from the article echoed in his mind, a discordant note in the symphony of his perfect plan. A manufacturing anomaly. It was too specific for a random lie, too technical. What if that clumsy oaf of a detective, with his cheap cigar and disheveled coat, had stumbled onto something by sheer idiotic luck? No, impossible. The plan was flawless, executed with surgical precision. But the possibility remained, an infinitesimal crack in his monument of self-assurance, an untied thread. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie, but his eyes were distant, replaying every second of the heist. The tools, the timing, the exit. What had he missed? The thought was a burr, catching and tearing at the smooth fabric of his composure.
It must be cut.
By midday, the quiet hum of his office felt like a scream. He couldn't focus on the market reports, the numbers blurring into meaningless squiggles. He strode to the hidden panel behind his bookshelf and retrieved the blueprints for the Sterling Trust Bank. He spread them across the vast expanse of his mahogany desk, his own meticulous notes laid out beside them. He traced the routes with his finger, his mind a frantic archive, searching for the anomaly, the flaw, the single wretched mistake that threatened to tarnish his masterpiece. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and burned coffee. Dust motes danced in the single beam of late afternoon sun that pierced the grimy window. Across the street, the Sterling Trust Bank stood like a stone fortress, impassive and silent. Colombo carefully wiped the large telephoto lens with a soft cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. The camera was mounted on a heavy tripod, a silent, patient predator. "Are you sure about this, Frank?" Officer Dave Miller shifted his weight on the creaking wooden chair. His face, etched with the lines of 30 years on the force, was a mask of skepticism. "We're on thin ice. If he doesn't show, Holloway will have our badges for breakfast." "He'll show," Colombo said, not looking up from his work. He screwed the lens back into place. A man like Thorne can't stand the thought of someone else finding a mistake in his work. It's not about the money, it's about the applause. And right now, he thinks he heard someone in the audience cough. He straightened up and poured a cup of thick black coffee from a thermos, handing it to the older officer. Miller took it, his gaze fixed on the bank. The sun dipped below the skyline and the streetlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows. The city's evening rush faded into a quiet hum, and then into a deeper silence. They sat in the dark, waiting, the only light a faint orange glow from the street below. Hours passed. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with anticipation. Then, a shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow across the street. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, moved with a liquid grace that was both elegant and unnerving. It was Thorne. He approached a side entrance, the service door, with no hesitation. His hands worked with an expert's economy of motion. There was no brute force, just the quiet, precise defeat of a complex lock. A small electronic device placed over the alarm panel silenced it before it could scream. The door clicked open, and he slipped inside, swallowed by the darkness of the building. The bank's interior was a cavern of moonlight and marble. Thorne's soft-soled shoes made no sound on the polished floors. He moved directly to the west wall, to the empty space where the Monet had hung. He pulled a penlight from his pocket, its sharp beam cutting through the gloom. He scanned the floor, the baseboards, the wall itself, searching for a fiber, a chemical trace, a ghost. He found nothing. His fluid grace began to evaporate, replaced by a rigid urgency. He retraced his steps to the teller's station, then along the path to the vault. His search grew more frantic, the beam of his light dancing erratically. His control, the very core of his being, was fracturing. In a sudden, uncharacteristic spasm of fury, his hand swept across a clerk's desk. A stack of loan applications cascaded to the floor, the rustle of paper, an explosion in the cavernous silence. Thorne froze, his body a taut silhouette of rage and disbelief. From his vantage point, Colombo saw it all. The world was reduced to the perfect circle of his viewfinder. He watched Thorne appear, his movements a dark ballet. He gave Miller a slight nod, his eye pressed firmly against the camera. He began to shoot. Click. Thorne at the door, his face a mask of concentration. Click. Thorne disabling the alarm, his fingers moving with practiced skill. Click. Thorne's shadow framed in the doorway, a ghost entering his own tomb. The mechanical sound of the shutter was the only noise in the room, sharp and final as a judge's gavel. Colombo tracked the frantic dance of the penlight, captured the growing desperation in Thorne's posture. He documented the silent tantrum, the scattered papers on the marble floor. Each photograph was a word, and together they were forming an undeniable sentence. Thorne finally emerged from the bank, his shoulders slumped. The arrogant predator was gone, replaced by a defeated man. He looked up and down the empty street, a lost soul in the city he thought he owned, before melting back into the shadows from which he came. Colombo took one last shot as he disappeared. He lowered the camera, its metal body cool against his hands. The weight felt good. It felt like proof. Miller let out a long, slow breath. "My God, Frank, you were right." Colombo turned from the window, his face half hidden in shadow, his eyes reflecting the distant city lights. He looked tired, but a deep, quiet satisfaction settled over his features. "Yeah, we got him, Dave," he said, his voice low and firm. "Now we can finally talk." The glossy 8x10 photographs lay scattered across Captain Holloway's desk, reflecting the harsh glare of the single desk lamp. They pushed aside stacks of paperwork and a cold, half-empty coffee mug. In the stark black and white, Julian Thorne's face was a mask of focused panic as he worked the lock of the Sterling Trust Bank. Dave Miller stood near the door, a silent, exhausted sentinel. Holloway picked up one of the prints, holding it close. The grain of the photograph was sharp, capturing the beads of sweat on Thorne's upper lip. He put it down and picked up another, then another, his silence stretching the air in the smoke-filled office until it was thin and sharp. He finally leaned back in his creaking chair, the leather groaning in protest. He looked from the damning images to the detective standing before him. "All this time, you were chasing a ghost." Holloway's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "And you caught him." Colombo said nothing. He just watched the captain, waiting. Holloway scrubbed a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. He took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember flaring in the shadows. "All right, Colombo," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke that coiled around the lamp. "Get him in here. Let's finish this." The next morning, the precinct hummed with its usual chaotic energy. Phones rang, typewriters clattered, and officers in uniform moved with purpose. Julian Thorne arrived precisely at 9, his suit perfectly tailored, his shoes gleaming. He carried an air of mild annoyance, a man of importance inconvenienced by the plodding machinery of law enforcement. He nodded curtly to the desk sergeant, expecting to be shown immediately to an office to clear up this final, tedious detail. As he waited, a young officer escorted a woman down the main corridor. She was pale, her hands clutched together at her waist. It was Elena Petrova. For a single, unguarded moment, Thorne's composure fractured. His eyes widened slightly, the confident line of his mouth tightening into something harder. It wasn't concern for her. It was the look of a chess master seeing an unexpected move on the board, a move that threatened his entire game. He quickly smoothed his expression back into one of detached curiosity, but the flicker had been there. From across the bustling room, partially obscured by a filing cabinet, Colombo watched it all. He took a slow puff from his cigar, the cheap smoke curling around his head. He had seen what he needed to see. The air in Captain Holloway's office was thick enough to chew. It smelled of stale smoke, old paper, and unspoken accusations. Thorne sat in the chair opposite the captain's desk, a portrait of calm irritation. Holloway was behind his desk, a silent, imposing figure. Elena Petrova was seated in a chair near the wall, as far from Thorne as the small room would allow, her gaze fixed on her own tightly clasped hands. Colombo paced slowly near the window, his raincoat unbuttoned, his hands deep in his pockets. "I appreciate you both coming in," Colombo began, his voice apologetic. "Just a few loose ends. It's been bothering me, you see, this whole case. It's too neat, too perfect, like a puzzle, where all the pieces fit so well, you start to suspect someone made the pieces just for you." Thorne glanced at his watch, a thin, elegant gold timepiece. "Detective, if you have a specific question, I have a board meeting at 11. Colombo stopped pacing and turned, a thoughtful frown on his face. "A question? No, not really a question. It's more, I've been trying to think like the man who planned it. A very smart man. A man who values order, precision. The kind of man who, if he walked into a room and saw a crooked picture on the wall, would have to straighten it, even if he was in the middle of committing a murder. It's a compulsion, you understand. Perfection." He glanced at Thorne, whose face remained a placid mask, though his perfectly polished shoe began to tap a silent, impatient rhythm on the worn linoleum. "And this man, he's not just neat, he's clever," Colombo continued, his voice a low, meandering drone. "He knows things. He knows, for instance, that there's a big construction project a few blocks from the bank. Knows the soil there is a specific kind of reddish clay. The kind of clay that might get on your shoes if you were to cut through the site to avoid being seen. A tiny detail, easy to miss." Elena flinched, a small, barely perceptible movement. Thorne's tapping foot stopped. "Then there's the pressure," Colombo said, his gaze drifting towards Elena. "This planner, he needs a pawn, someone he can control, someone in a desperate situation who he can push into a corner until she feels she has no choice but to do exactly as she's told. He's a master at that, at finding the little levers to make people move." He turned his attention back to Thorne, whose jaw was now set in a rigid line. "But the smartest people, they have the biggest egos. That's their blind spot. You see, this planner, he's so proud of his work, he can't stand the thought of someone else getting it wrong. So if he saw, say, a story in the newspaper that completely misunderstood his masterpiece, that got the details all wrong, well, he couldn't resist. He'd have to go back to the scene of the crime, in the middle of the night, just to make sure his perfect little plan hadn't been compromised by some fool reporter. He'd have to check. Colombo finally stopped moving and stood in the center of the room, looking directly at Thorne. The air crackled with tension. Holloway lit a cigarette, the scrape of the match unnaturally loud. "It all fits," Colombo said with a heavy sigh. "Everything except one little thing. A stupid detail, really, but it's the one piece that doesn't make sense to me." He paused, letting the silence hang. Thorne stared back, his eyes like chips of ice. "The one thing I can't figure out, sir, is why you used Kent cigarettes in the plan," Colombo said, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "You smoke Parliament. You gave the pack to the stuntman to leave behind, but that's not your style. A perfectionist like you would have thought of that. It's a mistake. A sloppy one." A sneer twisted the corner of Thorne's mouth. The condescension, the intellectual superiority he had held back for so long, finally broke through his control. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "You fool, detective," he scoffed. "That was a misdirection. The Kents were meant to be found. The real clue I was worried about was the residue from the modeling clay on the vault floor. It had a unique chemical binder that could have been traced back." He stopped. The words hung in the dead air of the room. His face went slack, the color draining from it as the magnitude of his mistake crashed down upon him. The sneer vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The room was utterly silent. Elena looked up, her eyes wide. Holloway slowly put his cigarette down in the overflowing ashtray. Colombo's expression was not one of triumph, but of a weary sadness. He turned his head slightly towards the captain. "I think that's what we needed to hear, Captain." Holloway gave a short, sharp nod to the uniformed officer standing by the door. The officer stepped forward, handcuffs glinting under the dim office light. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Julian Thorne's wrist echoed in the silent office. It was a sound of absolute finality, a full stop at the end of a meticulously crafted sentence. The architect did not flinch or resist. Instead, a change passed over him that was more profound than any physical struggle. The spine that had been ramrod straight seemed to dissolve, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the steel on his wrists was the weight of the entire world. The mask of intellectual superiority, so carefully worn, cracked and fell away, revealing not rage, but a cold, hollow void. The uniformed officer, a young man with practiced impersonal movements, touched Thorne's elbow. "Time to go, sir." Thorne's head lifted slowly. His eyes, dark and suddenly vacant, scanned the room and found Colombo's. There was no plea in them, no spark of defiance. There was only the pure, distilled hatred of a grandmaster for the pawn that had inexplicably checkmated him. It was a look that acknowledged defeat, not at the hands of a superior intellect, but by a flaw in his own perfect design. He had been undone by a simple, grubby detail and by the man who lived for them. As the officer guided him toward the door, he passed Elena Petrova. She stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning freedom. Thorne didn't even look at her. She was a tool, now broken and discarded, no longer relevant to the grand equation. Another officer, a woman with a gentle expression, approached Elena. Before following her out to give a formal statement, Elena turned to Colombo. Her gaze was unsteady, shimmering with unshed tears. She took a step toward him, her lips parting, but no sound came out. She tried again, and this time a single, fragile whisper filled the space between them. "Thank you." Colombo gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. It wasn't just thanks for catching a murderer. It was for giving her back her own life. A life Thorne had stolen long before he'd ever touched the bank's vault. Then they were gone. The door clicked shut, leaving only Colombo and Captain Holloway in the sudden, heavy silence. The room felt immense, emptied of its tension. All that remained was the stale aftermath. The lingering scent of Thorne's expensive cologne clashing with the bitter aroma of burnt coffee and Holloway's overflowing ashtray. The captain hadn't moved. He sat hunched behind his fortress of a desk, staring down at a manila folder as if he were trying to set it alight with his gaze alone. The single cone of light from his desk lamp illuminated the chaos of his paperwork, casting long, deep shadows that concealed his expression. Minutes stretched into a quiet eternity. Colombo stood by the window, his hands in the pockets of his raincoat, watching the slow dance of headlights on the wet street below. He felt a familiar hollowness settle in his gut, the quiet that always followed the noise of a solved case. It wasn't victory, It was just order. A piece of the world, knocked askew, had been set right again. That was all. Finally, Holloway stirred. He let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire department. Without looking up, he reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. The sound of wood scraping against wood was loud in the quiet room. His hand emerged holding Colombo's badge, its polished surface catching the lamplight, and his service weapon, heavy and dark. He placed them on the edge of the desk and, with a deliberate shove, sent them sliding across the polished mahogany. They came to a stop directly in front of Colombo. The gesture was an entire speech, an apology, a concession, a commendation. Holloway finally lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot with fatigue. He looked at Colombo, really looked at him, and for a moment, the gruff mask of the captain was gone, replaced by a man simply tired of the city's endless parade of darkness. "Go home, Colombo. The paperwork will still be here in the morning." "Captain," Colombo said, his voice quiet. He picked up his badge, its familiar weight a comfort in his palm, and slid it into his pocket. He holstered his weapon, the click of it settling into place, another small sound of finality. He turned and walked out of the office without another word. The squad room was a different world from the one he had left hours ago. The frantic energy had dissipated, replaced by the low, steady hum of the night shift. A few detectives typed reports with 2 fingers, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their monitors. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and indifference. No one looked up as he passed. The case was closed. The machine moved on. Outside, the night air was cool and damp, carrying the faint, salty tang of the distant harbor. A fine mist hung in the air, blurring the edges of the streetlights into soft, hazy halos. Colombo didn't go to his car. He started walking, his footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement. He didn't have a destination in mind, but his feet seemed to know the way. He found himself standing in front of the 24/7 grocery store, its fluorescent lights a harsh, sterile beacon in the sleeping city. It was the same store, the same relentless brightness he'd stood in what felt like a lifetime ago. He pushed through the glass door, the little bell above it chiming cheerfully. Inside, the air was chilled and smelled of disinfectant. A young clerk with tired eyes barely glanced up from his phone. Colombo walked down the aisle, his movements slow and deliberate. He passed the rows of brightly colored cereal boxes and neatly stacked cans, the mundane architecture of ordinary life. He stopped in front of the refrigerated section. The hum of the coolers was a steady, monotonous drone. Behind the glass door, beaded with condensation, were rows and rows of beer bottles. He found the one he was looking for, a simple domestic lager. He took a single bottle, its cold glass shocking his warm hand. The transaction was brief, impersonal. The clerk scanned the bottle, mumbled the price. Colombo paid with a few crumpled bills from his pocket, took his change, and walked back out into the night. He crossed the street and stopped, his back against the cold brick of an old warehouse. Across the way, the Sterling Trust Bank stood dark and silent, an imposing block of granite and glass against the bruised purple sky. It was just a building now, its secrets laid bare, its carefully constructed facade of invincibility shattered. It held no more mystery for him. Colombo twisted the cap off the bottle. The hiss of escaping air was the only sound in the quiet street. He raised the bottle to his lips and took a long swallow. The beer was cold, bitter, and utterly unremarkable. He stood there for a long time, watching the fog roll in, slowly erasing the hard edges of the city. Then he lowered the bottle, turned his collar up against the damp chill, and walked away, his solitary figure slowly dissolving into the hazy glow of the streetlights.